A millionaire got a homeless woman pregnant. Everyone made fun of him, but time passed and they were left stunned. Welcome to the channel. Enjoy the video, give it a like, subscribe, turn on notifications, comment and share. The heavy snow falling outside Thomas Barrett's office window matched the weight he carried in his heart. Every year as winter approached in Boston, the memories he tried so hard to suppress would resurface, haunting him like unwelcome guests. He stood there, watching the snowflakes dance in the bitter December wind, his reflection in the glass showing a man worn down not by his 45 years, but by the secrets he kept. The sound of his office phone ringing pulled him back to reality. "Barrett Construction," he answered, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had built his business from the ground up. "Mr. Barrett, there's an emergency call from Dorchester, a tenant with severe water damage in her apartment. She's quite desperate," his secretary informed him. Thomas rubbed his temples, feeling a headache coming on. The last thing he needed was another emergency job, especially with 3 ongoing renovation projects already stretching his resources thin. But something made him ask, "What's the client's name?" "Sarah Collins." She mentioned having a young son, and with this cold snap, Thomas felt his heart skip a beat. The name sparked something in his memory, but he quickly pushed the thought aside. "Tell her I'll be there myself within the hour." As he drove through the snowing streets of Boston in his work truck, Thomas couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in his stomach. His business partner, Robert Walsh, had been telling him to delegate more, to stop taking every emergency call personally. "You can't keep running from your past by burying yourself in work," Robert had said just last week, knowing too well the burden Thomas carried. The apartment building in Dorchester was exactly what Thomas expected, an aging 3-story structure, desperately needing maintenance. As he parked his truck, he noticed a young woman hurrying down the icy steps, clutching a little boy's hand. Something about her made him freeze in place. Sarah Collins was nothing like he had imagined over the phone. In her early 30s, she had a natural beauty that seemed untouched by the obvious stress in her life, but it was the little boy beside her that caught Thomas's attention. The child couldn't have been more than 5 or 6, wrapped in a coat that seemed a size too small, his face pale but wearing a bright smile that seemed strangely familiar. "Mr. Barrett, thank you for coming so quickly," Sarah said, her breath visible in the cold air. "I'm sorry to be such a bother, but the water damage is getting worse, and with Matthew's condition..." "Condition?" Thomas found himself asking, even as he followed them up the stairs. "I have a special heart," the little boy, Matthew announced proudly, touching his chest. "But Mom says I'm brave like a superhero." Thomas felt an unexpected lump in his throat. He watched as Matthew carefully climbed the stairs, one hand holding his mother's, the other gripping the railing. Something about the way the boy moved, the determined set of his jaw, stirred memories Thomas had locked away years ago. The apartment was modest but well kept, despite the obvious water damage spreading across the living room ceiling. As Thomas examined the extent of the problem, he couldn't help but notice the medical bills scattered on the kitchen counter, the calendar marked with doctor's appointments, and the collection of prescription bottles neatly arranged on a high shelf. "It started 3 days ago," Sarah explained, her voice tight with worry. "I called the building manager, but he said it would be weeks before their regular maintenance team could look at it. With Matthew's condition, we can't risk any mold developing." The doctor was very clear about that. Thomas found himself studying Sarah's face more carefully. There was something hauntingly familiar about her features, something that tugged at the edges of his memory. "Have we met before?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Sarah shook her head, though there was a moment's hesitation in her eyes. "I don't think so. I would remember," but Thomas wasn't so sure. As he began examining the water damage more closely, his mind raced back 7 years, to a time when his life had been very different, before the accident that had torn his world apart, before his marriage to Diane had crumbled under the weight of their shared grief. "Mom, can I show Mr. Barrett my drawings?" Matthew's voice broke through Thomas's thoughts. "Not now, sweetheart. Mr. Barrett needs to work," Sarah replied, but Thomas found himself saying, "It's okay, I'd like to see them." Matthew's face lit up as he retrieved a folder full of crayon drawings. As the boy showed him picture after picture, Thomas noticed something that made his blood run cold. In one corner of each drawing, Matthew had signed his name with a distinctive backward S, exactly the same way Thomas had done as a child, a habit that had driven his own mother crazy. "The leak seems to be coming from the unit above," Thomas said finally. forcing himself to focus on the job at hand. "I'll need to check it out, but I can start work tomorrow morning. First thing." "Oh, I should be honest with you," Sarah began, her face flushing. "I got quotes from other contractors, but they were all beyond what I can afford right now. With Matthew's medical expenses, Thomas made a decision that had nothing to do with business sense. We'll work something out," he said firmly. "The important thing is getting this fixed before it affects your son's health." As he drove away from Dorchester that evening, Thomas's mind was in turmoil. He pulled over in a parking lot and took out his phone, his hands shaking slightly as he dialed Robert's number. "I need you to look into something for me," he said when his friend answered. "It's about a woman named Sarah Collins. She would have been in Boston about 6 years ago." "Thomas," Robert's voice was cautious. "What's going on?" "I'm not sure yet," Thomas replied, watching the snow continue to fall. "But I think I might have just met my son." That night, sleep eluded Thomas completely. He sat in his home office in Beacon Hill, surrounded by the success he'd built over the years, yet feeling emptier than ever. The framed business license on the wall, showing Barrett Construction, quality home improvements, seemed to mock him with its promise of building better futures. His phone buzzed with a text from Robert. "Found something, need to talk in person. Tomorrow morning, usual coffee shop?" Thomas stared at the message, his heart racing. Before he could reply, another text came through, this one from his ex-wife, Diane. "Heard you took on a job in Dorchester. Since when does Barrett Construction work in that area? We need to talk about the company's image." He ignored Diane's message. Even though they'd been divorced for 3 years, she still held 20% of the company's shares and never missed an opportunity to remind him of it. Their marriage had fallen apart after the accident, but sometimes Thomas wondered if it had been broken long before that. The next morning, Thomas arrived early at the construction supply store, purchasing materials for Sarah's apartment repair. As he loaded his truck with supplies, his mind wandered to Matthew's drawings. That backward S kept haunting him. It couldn't be just a coincidence, could it? At 7:30, he walked into Joe's coffee shop, where Robert was already waiting in their usual corner booth. His friend's serious expression told Thomas everything he needed to know. There was something significant to discuss. "Before I tell you what I found," Robert began, keeping his voice low, "I need you to remember what happened 6 years ago. You weren't in a good place then, Thomas. After losing—" "I remember," Thomas cut him off sharply. The memories of that time were like shards of glass in his mind. The accident, the grief, the drinking that followed. "Just tell me what you found out about Sarah." Robert pulled out his tablet, bringing up some old social media posts. "Sarah Collins worked as a waitress at the Green Light Bar 6 years ago. Ring any bells?" Thomas felt the color drain from his face. The Green Light Bar, where he'd spent countless nights trying to drink away his pain after the accident. Where he'd met a kind-hearted waitress who'd listened to his grief-stricken ramblings night after night. "There's more," Robert continued. "She left her job there suddenly around March that year, 9 months before Matthew was born." Thomas gripped his coffee cup so hard his knuckles turned white. Why didn't she tell me? Why didn't she try to find me? Think about it, Thomas. You were a mess back then. Different name, too. You were still using your middle name, James, trying to hide from yourself. And after what happened with Diane and the accident, before Robert could finish, Thomas's phone rang. It was Sarah Collins. "Mr. Barrett, I'm so sorry to call this early, but Matthew's not feeling well. The dampness in the apartment. Is there any way you could start the work today?" Thomas was already standing up, leaving his untouched coffee behind. "I'll be there in 30 minutes. When he arrived at Sarah's apartment, he found Matthew sitting on the couch, his breathing slightly labored. The boy's face lit up when he saw Thomas, and that smile. How had Thomas not recognized it immediately? It was his mother's smile, the same one that looked back at him from old family photos. "The doctor says he needs to stay warm and dry," Sarah explained, worry etched on her face. "I tried to get him to go to my friend's house, but he insisted on staying to watch you work. He's fascinated by construction. Just like his—" Thomas caught himself just in time. "Just like a real supervisor," he finished lamely. As Thomas worked on the ceiling, he kept glancing at Matthew, who watched every move with intense interest. The boy had spread his drawings on the coffee table, occasionally holding one up to show Thomas his latest creation. "This is my dream house," Matthew explained, pointing to a crayon drawing of a blue building. "Mom says we'll have our own house someday, with a yard and everything." Sarah, who was sorting through bills at the kitchen table, looked up with a sad smile. Someday, sweetheart. Right now we need to focus on getting you better. Thomas noticed her discreetly wiping away a tear as she looked at what appeared to be another medical bill. The sight stirred something deep within him, a mixture of guilt, responsibility, and an overwhelming need to help. As he worked, Thomas observed their interactions, noting how Sarah's entire world seemed to revolve around Matthew. The boy's medication schedule was posted on the refrigerator, along with a calendar marked with doctor's appointments and what looked like payment due dates. During his lunch break, Thomas received another call from Diane. "I drove by the office and you weren't there," she said, her voice sharp with suspicion. "Robert wouldn't tell me where you were." "What's going on, Thomas?" "I'm handling a special project," he replied curtly. "Special project? Since when do you personally handle repairs in Dorchester? This isn't like you." "Thomas, remember what happened the last time you let your emotions drive your business decisions?" Thomas ended the call without responding. Diane had always been good at hitting where it hurt most, using his past mistakes as weapons against him. Later that afternoon, as Thomas was finishing up for the day, Matthew had another episode. His breathing became more labored, and Sarah rushed to get his medication. "Sometimes his heart beats too fast," Sarah explained, as she helped Matthew with his inhaler. "The doctors say he needs surgery, but—" She trailed off, looking at the bills spread across the kitchen table. Thomas felt a physical pain in his chest watching them. The boy who might be his son needed help, and here he was, a successful business owner, pretending to be just another contractor. As he packed up his tools, Matthew tugged at his sleeve. "Will you come back tomorrow, Mr. Barrett? I want to show you my new drawings." "Of course I will," Thomas replied, his voice thick with emotion. Outside in his truck, Thomas sat for a long moment, watching the snow begin to fall again. He pulled out his phone and called Robert. "I need you to do one more thing for me," he said. "Find out everything you can about Matthew's medical condition. And Robert, I need you to be discreet. If Diane finds out about this, she'll try to use it against you like she did with everything else after the accident," Robert finished. "I know, but Thomas, you need to be sure about this. If that boy really is your son—" "He is," Thomas said firmly. "I can feel it, and I'm not going to fail him like I failed." He couldn't finish the sentence, the memory of his loss still too painful to voice. As Thomas drove home through the snowy streets of Boston, his mind was racing with possibilities and fears. How could he tell Sarah the truth about who he was? How would she react to knowing he was the same man who'd spent those nights at the Green Light Bar, pouring out his grief to a kind waitress? And most importantly, how could he help Matthew without destroying the life Sarah had built for them? The snow was falling harder now, reminding him of another winter night 6 years ago when his world had first started to unravel. But this time, instead of running from his past, Thomas knew he had to face it head-on, for Matthew's sake. The next morning brought more than just another workday. As Thomas pulled up to Sarah's apartment building, he found Robert waiting for him, holding a manila envelope and wearing a grave expression that made Thomas's stomach tighten. "You need to see this," Robert said, handing him the envelope. Inside were Matthew's medical records, legally obtained through Robert's connections at the hospital where he sat on the board of trustees. Thomas's hands trembled as he read the diagnosis: congenital heart defect, requiring immediate surgical intervention. The estimated cost of the surgery made his breath catch. It was more money than Sarah could hope to save in years on her modest salary. But what truly shook him was the last page, Matthew's birth certificate. Mother, Sarah Collins. Father, unknown. Date of birth, exactly 8 months and 2 weeks after his last visit to the Green Light Bar. "There's more," Robert said quietly. "Diane's been asking questions. She drove by here yesterday afternoon. She knows something's going on, Thomas." Before Thomas could respond, he heard Matthew's voice behind them. "Mr. Barrett, Mom made breakfast for you." The boy was standing in the doorway, wrapped in his too-small coat, his face glowing with excitement despite its pallor. Thomas quickly tucked the envelope into his jacket. "That's very kind of her, Matthew. Why don't you head back inside where it's warm? I'll be right there." After the boy disappeared inside, Robert grabbed Thomas's arm. "Be careful. Remember what happened when Diane found out about your trust fund. She'll use anything she can to hurt you." Inside the apartment, Sarah had indeed prepared a simple breakfast of coffee and toast. "It's not much," she apologized, "but you've been so kind about the payment arrangements, it's the least I could do." As they sat at the small kitchen table, Matthew proudly showed Thomas his newest drawing, a detailed sketch of a construction site, complete with a stick figure wearing a hard hat that was clearly meant to be Thomas. "Mom says you're fixing our home like a guardian angel," Matthew said innocently, causing Sarah to blush. "Matthew, honey, please don't embarrass Mr. Barrett," she scolded gently, but Thomas felt his heart swell at the boy's words. The morning progressed with Thomas working on the repairs, while trying to process everything he'd learned. Every few minutes, Matthew would ask questions about the tools or the repair process, showing the same curiosity about building things that Thomas had possessed as a child. Around noon, Sarah received a phone call that changed everything. Thomas watched as her face went pale, her hands gripping the phone tightly. "Yes, doctor, I understand," she said, her voice trembling. "But isn't there any way to—" "Yes. I know time is crucial, but the cost—" She turned away, trying to hide her tears from Matthew. After she hung up, Thomas found her in the kitchen, silently crying while pretending to wash dishes. "Sarah," he said softly, "is everything okay?" She wiped her eyes quickly. "It's nothing. Just medical stuff. Matthew's condition is getting worse, and the doctors say we can't wait much longer for the surgery. But unless I can come up with $50,000 in the next few weeks—" She broke off, her shoulders shaking. Thomas felt the weight of his secret becoming unbearable. He opened his mouth to speak, to tell her everything, when suddenly there was a knock at the door. Sarah went to answer it, and Thomas's blood ran cold when he heard a familiar voice. "Hello, I'm Diane Barrett from Elite Realty. I couldn't help but notice the construction work being done here, and I wanted to discuss some concerns about unauthorized modifications to the building." Thomas stepped into view, watching as recognition flickered across Diane's face, followed by a calculating smile that he knew all too well. "Why, Thomas," she said sweetly, "I had no idea you were handling this project personally." "How interesting." Sarah looked between them, confusion evident on her face. "You two know each other?" "Oh yes," Diane replied before Thomas could speak. "Thomas and I know each other very well. In fact—" She paused, her eyes falling on Matthew, who had come to stand beside his mother. Something in Diane's expression changed as she looked at the boy, her eyes narrowing slightly. "This is a private business matter," Thomas cut in firmly. "We can discuss this later, Diane." "Can we?" Diane's voice was honey-coated poison. "Like we discussed things 6 years ago. Or should I say like we didn't discuss things?" Sarah was looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Perhaps I should give you two some privacy." "No need," Diane said, her smile never wavering. "I just wanted to see for myself what was so important that Thomas would take on a job in this neighborhood. Now I understand completely." Her gaze lingered meaningfully on Matthew. After Diane left, Sarah turned to Thomas, her eyes filled with questions. What was that about? And why did she look at Matthew that way? Thomas knew the moment of truth was approaching faster than he'd planned, but before he could respond, Matthew suddenly clutched his chest, his face contorting in pain. "Mom," he gasped, and Sarah was instantly at his side, helping him to the couch and reaching for his medication. "Should I call an ambulance?" Thomas asked, his heart racing with fear. No, he'll be okay. This happens sometimes when he gets excited or stressed." Sarah's voice was calm, but Thomas could see the terror in her eyes as she held her son. As he watched them, Thomas made a decision. He stepped out into the hallway and called Robert. "I need you to start the paperwork," he said quietly. "I'm selling my shares in the company." "Thomas, think about this," Robert warned. "Diane will fight you every step of the way." "I don't care. That boy in there needs surgery, and I'm done pretending I don't know who he is." When he went back inside, Matthew was breathing easier, though his face was still pale. Sarah was singing softly to him, the same lullaby Thomas's mother used to sing to him as a child. The sight nearly broke him. How many more signs did he need? How much longer could he keep this secret? The following morning brought a heavy snowstorm to Boston, but it wasn't the weather that sent chills down Thomas's spine. It was the text message from Diane. "Meet me at the office now or I start making phone calls." Thomas found her waiting in his office, sitting in his chair like she still owned the place. Through the window behind her, snow was falling in thick curtains, creating an eerily appropriate backdrop for what he knew would be an unpleasant confrontation. "I did some research last night," Diane began, sliding a folder across his desk. "Sarah Collins, age 32, single mother, and her son Matthew, age 5. The timing is rather interesting, isn't it? Whatever you're thinking of doing, Diane." Thinking? She laughed coldly. I'm not thinking about doing anything. I'm wondering why my ex-husband is secretly helping the woman he got pregnant while we were still married. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. That's not what happened. No? Diane stood up, her designer heels clicking on the hardwood floor. Then refresh my memory, Thomas. Where exactly were you all those nights after we lost David? While I was grieving our son, you were drowning your sorrows at that disgusting bar in South Boston. The mention of David's name hit Thomas like a physical blow. Their 8-year-old son, lost to a drunk driver 6 years ago. The pain that had torn their marriage apart and sent Thomas into a spiral of grief and alcohol. You're right, Thomas admitted quietly. I was at that bar, and Sarah was there too, as a waitress. She was kind to me during the worst time of my life. But I never knew. I didn't know about Matthew until now. How convenient, Diane sneered. And now that you know, what's your plan? Sell your shares in our company to pay for the boy's surgery? Throw away everything we built together? Our company? Thomas's voice rose. You haven't cared about this company since the divorce. The only reason you kept your shares was to maintain control over me. Because someone had to stop you from making emotional decisions that would destroy everything, Diane shot back. Just like after David died, when you wanted to donate all our savings to that children's hospital. Before Thomas could respond, his phone buzzed. It was Sarah. His heart stopped when he saw the message. Matthew's in the hospital, please come if you can. Without a word to Diane, he grabbed his coat and headed for the door. If you walk out that door, Diane called after him, I'll make sure everyone knows about your dirty little secret, including the board members who think you're such a pillar of the community. Thomas turned back to her, suddenly feeling calmer than he had in years. Go ahead. I don't care anymore. That boy needs help, and I'm done running from the truth. The drive to the hospital was a blur through the snowstorm. Thomas found Sarah in the pediatric ward, looking small and frightened in the harsh fluorescent lighting. His heart rate wouldn't stabilize, she explained, her voice shaking. The doctors say he can't wait any longer for the surgery, but the hospital needs proof of payment before they'll schedule it. And She broke down, tears streaming down her face. Thomas took her hands in his. Sarah, there's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you days ago. But before he could continue, a nurse approached them. Ms. Collins, the doctor would like to discuss Matthew's test results. Sarah squeezed Thomas's hands. Please wait, I need a friend right now. Friend. The word twisted in Thomas's gut as he watched her follow the nurse. How could he tell her now, when she was already dealing with so much? His phone buzzed again. Robert this time. Diane's called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. She's trying to block the sale of your shares. Thomas walked to the window, watching the snow continue to fall. In the reflection, he caught sight of himself and was struck by how much he looked like the old photos of his father. Photos that showed the same determined set of jaw that he'd noticed in Matthew. A commotion down the hall drew his attention. Sarah was arguing with a hospital administrator, her voice rising in desperation. Please, you don't understand. He needs this surgery now. I'll sign whatever payment plans you want. I'm sorry, Ms. Collins, but without at least a 50% deposit, we cannot schedule the procedure. Thomas stepped forward, his decision made. Schedule the surgery, he said firmly. I'll have the full payment transferred to the hospital this afternoon. Both Sarah and the administrator turned to stare at him. Mr. Barrett, I can't let you do this, Sarah protested. It's too much. Sarah? Thomas took a deep breath, knowing the moment of truth had finally arrived. There's something you need to know about the green light bar. About 6 years ago, her face changed as recognition slowly dawned. James, she whispered, using the name she'd known him by back then. You're him. The administrator quietly excused himself, leaving them alone in the hallway. I didn't know, Thomas said softly. I swear I didn't know about Matthew. I was in such a dark place then, after losing my son, David. I changed my name back to Thomas, moved to a different part of the city. I was running from everything. Sarah's face had gone pale. All this time, you knew who I was when you came to fix the apartment. I recognized you that first day, but I wasn't sure until I saw Matthew. He has my mother's smile, Sarah, and the way he draws that backward S. I used to do the same thing at his age. Sarah took a step back from Thomas, her eyes filled with a mixture of confusion, anger and fear. The hospital corridor suddenly seemed too small, too confining for the weight of this revelation. All these years, she whispered, I thought about trying to find you, but you were so broken then, so lost in your grief. I didn't want to add to your burden. And then when Matthew was born with his heart condition, she wrapped her arms around herself, as if trying to hold herself together. Before Thomas could respond, a nurse appeared. Ms. Collins, Matthew's asking for both of you. They found Matthew propped up in his hospital bed, looking tiny among all the monitoring equipment. His face lit up when he saw them, unaware of the emotional storm brewing between the adults. Mom, Mr. Barrett, look! He held up another drawing, this one showing 3 stick figures holding hands. It's us, he explained proudly, like a real family. Sarah made a small, choked sound, and Thomas felt his heart constrict. The innocent wisdom of children sometimes cut deeper than any adult truth. Matthew, Thomas said gently, pulling a chair close to the bed. Would you like to hear a story? A true story? The boy nodded eagerly, and Sarah sank into a chair on the opposite side of the bed, her eyes never leaving Thomas's face. Once, Thomas began, his voice thick with emotion, there was a man who lost someone very precious to him. His little boy. He was so sad that he forgot how to be happy. But then he met a very kind woman who helped him remember how to smile again. Matthew listened intently, his small hand finding Thomas's larger one. Was the kind woman my mum? Thomas nodded, feeling tears threatening to fall. Yes, she was. But the man was very foolish. He was so busy running away from his sadness that he didn't know he was also running away from something wonderful. A chance to be a father again, like you're my father, Matthew asked quietly, showing a perception well beyond his years. The question hung in the air for a moment before Sarah spoke, her voice trembling. Yes, sweetheart, Mr. Barrett, Thomas is your father. Just then there was a commotion at the door. Diane stood there, clutching a stack of papers, her face flushed with anger. So it's true, she said. You're really going to throw everything away for them? Diane, this isn't the place, Thomas warned, standing protectively between her and the hospital bed. Oh, I think it's exactly the place, she snapped. While you're here playing happy families, I've been at the office, showing the board exactly why you're unfit to make company decisions. They've agreed to block the sale of your shares. You're wrong, Robert's voice came from behind her. He stepped into the room, holding up his phone. The sale went through an hour ago. I had power of attorney, remember? Thomas signed it over to me yesterday. Diane's face contorted with rage. You can't do this. After everything we went through with David, how can you just... David would have wanted this. Thomas cut her off firmly. Our son had the biggest heart of anyone I've ever known. He would have been the first to help Matthew. Don't you dare use our son to justify this. Diane's voice rose hysterically. Mrs. Barrett, a security guard appeared at the door. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This is a pediatric ward. As Diane was escorted out, her heels clicking angrily down the corridor, Matthew spoke up. Was David my brother? Thomas returned to his seat, taking Matthew's small hand in his again. Yes, he was, and he would have loved you very much. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes. Thomas, the money, the company. You shouldn't have... The company was just a way for me to hide from life, Thomas interrupted. From love, from pain, from everything. But looking at Matthew, I see a second chance. Not to replace David. No one could ever replace him. But to be the father I should have been all along. Robert cleared his throat from the doorway. The surgery's been scheduled for tomorrow morning. Everything's been paid for, including the aftercare. Matthew's face brightened. Will my heart be all better then? The doctors will do their very best, Sarah assured him, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. And we'll both be right here waiting for you, Thomas added. Later that evening, after Matthew had fallen asleep, Thomas and Sarah stood by the window, watching the snow continue to fall over Boston. I don't expect anything from you, Thomas said quietly. I know I have no right to just walk into your lives like this, but I want to help, to be there for both of you in whatever way you'll let me. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. You know, that winter at the Green Light Bar, you told me something I never forgot. You said that sometimes the worst storms bring the most beautiful mornings. Thomas remembered. It had been one of his darkest nights, the anniversary of David's death, and Sarah had stayed late after her shift just to make sure he got home safely. The morning after Matthew was born, she continued, there was a snowstorm just like this one. I was alone in the hospital, terrified because they'd just told me about his heart condition, but when I held him, watching the snow fall outside, I felt hope for the first time in months. Thomas turned to her, his eyes sincere. I can't change the past, Sarah. I can't undo the years I wasn't there, but if you'll let me, I'd like to be part of your future, both of yours. Sarah looked at their sleeping son, then back at Thomas. "We'll take it one day at a time," she said softly, "starting tomorrow with the surgery." The next morning, as they watched Matthew being wheeled into surgery, Thomas and Sarah stood together, their shared love for their son bridging the years of separation between them. Hours later, when the doctor emerged with news of the surgery's success, they embraced, both crying tears of joy and relief. And as the winter sun broke through the clouds, casting golden light across the snow-covered city, Thomas realized that sometimes life's greatest gifts come disguised as its biggest challenges. In trying to fix a leaking ceiling, he had found his way back to love, to family, and to the father he was always meant to be. Matthew's recovery would take time. Matthew's recovery, just like healing the wounds of the past. But as Thomas watched his son sleeping peacefully in the recovery room, his heart now strong and steady, he knew that some storms were worth weathering, because they lead you exactly where you need to be.